20 officers, some still in uniform, others recently retired, were just arrested in one of the most alarming takedowns of law enforcement corruption in recent history. Their crime: operating as a cartel pipeline. This wasn't one rogue cop. This wasn't a bad apple slipping through the cracks. This was a $3.4 million operation. Organized, calculated, sustained, and protected from the inside.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
Operation Shattered Shield didn't just uncover misconduct, it exposed a full-blown infiltration of American law enforcement by the Sinaloa and CJ&G cartels. The FBI and DEA didn't stumble across this. They spent nearly 3 years pulling apart a network that had turned police departments into extensions of cartel logistics. They used their cruisers to escort drug shipments. They forged documents, created ghost contracts, and moved money through shell companies with the kind of precision that should have been stopping crime, not helping it cross state lines. Mississippi was ground zero. But this wasn't isolated. The network spanned multiple states, making use of officers who should have been protecting communities. Instead, they were running protection for the cartels. Literally. They drove the loads. They cleared the routes. They buried the evidence. Some of these officers were respected members of their towns. The kind of people families waved to at the grocery store. The kind of people that kids were told to trust. And that trust completely shattered. It didn't happen overnight. This wasn't impulsive corruption. This was a coordinated criminal enterprise that evolved over years. It used the cover of official power to stay hidden. And for a long time it worked. The officers involved weren't just looking the other way. They were actively facilitating drug trafficking, escorting shipments through rural backroads in patrol vehicles, laundering money through businesses they secretly controlled, falsifying records to clear the path for criminal activity. Federal investigators pieced it all together with over 50 hours of covert recordings, surveillance footage, encrypted message intercepts, and financial documents. Every single bit of evidence pointed to one thing: this wasn't some fluke. It was a system, built with intent, fueled by greed, and camouflaged by the badge. When the raids hit, they weren't symbolic. They were surgical. Tactical teams moved on officers' homes, departments, front companies, and stash locations all at once. Precincts were swept. Arrests were made on the spot. And some of the same officers who had once led community safety briefings were suddenly being led away in cuffs. The fallout was immediate. Public trust didn't just drop, it imploded. People who had believed in their local departments were left stunned. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was structural. Because this operation made one thing painfully clear: the biggest threat wasn't coming from outside, it was already inside. Wearing a badge, drawing a paycheck, shaking hands at community meetings. In the aftermath, agencies moved quickly to distance themselves. Oversight boards were set up. Audits were launched. Special bureaus were created to investigate further breaches. And while those reforms matter, they're only the beginning. Because corruption like this doesn't start at arrest. It starts when internal systems are weak, when accountability gets ignored, when red flags get dismissed, and when criminal networks spot the openings. Cartels don't just rely on muscle. They rely on relationships, on vulnerabilities, on finding people inside the system who are willing or desperate enough to become part of it. And the deeper investigators went, the more they uncovered. The fraud, the money trails, the forged signatures, it all pointed to a criminal operation that had been growing quietly under the nose of the law. This wasn't just about moving product. It was about laundering millions, building fake businesses, forging credibility, using every bureaucratic crack to pass through unnoticed. The network moved cash and narcotics while cloaking itself in legitimacy. And for nearly 3 years, it worked. The total value of the network: over $3.4 million in fraud and drug proceeds. And that's just what investigators have accounted for so far. What started as a suspicion in one precinct eventually blew open an interstate scandal. It escalated from local irregularities to a federal operation involving the FBI, DEA, and specialized task forces. And that escalation was necessary because what they found couldn't be handled at the local level. It was too big, too embedded. Some of the officers arrested had close ties to private security firms. Some were linked to political donors or community organizations. Some had moved seamlessly between public service and private contracts, using both to mask illicit activity. And this crossover, it's exactly what made the network so hard to detect. It wasn't just happening in dark corners. It was happening in plain sight, with paperwork, with legal shields, with access to systems designed to protect the public but repurposed to protect the criminals. That's the core of the betrayal. Not just the drugs, not just the money, but the abuse of power, the use of institutional authority to run cover for cartels. And when that power is corrupted, the damage spreads fast, through communities, through institutions, through trust. That's why post-operation reforms were non-negotiable. Structural change wasn't optional, it was the only path forward. Agencies had to rethink everything, from background checks to accountability mechanisms, from who gets oversight power to how financial audits are conducted. Because the shield only works if it's clean. And in this case, it wasn't just cracked, it was exploited. This case is now being studied as a model, not just for how corruption spreads but for how it can be dismantled. Multi-agency coordination, financial intelligence, digital surveillance, and most of all, time. 3 years. That's how long it took to take this network down. Because this wasn't about catching one trafficker. It was about entangling an entire ecosystem of dirty money, compromised officers, and bureaucratic loopholes. It took strategy, not just strength. Organized crime networks adapt constantly. They move quickly. They change faces, shell companies, and tactics. And unless law enforcement stays faster, stays more transparent, they will always be one step behind. This operation is a warning, not just to the cartels, but to institutions. It shows how quickly internal corruption can be weaponized by external actors, and how silence, delay, or denial only makes it worse. The fight isn't over. It never is. But this time, the message is clear. If the shield is used to protect criminals, it will be broken, and those responsible will be exposed. If you've made it this far and you're stunned by the scale of this betrayal, so are we. Let us know what you think. Are oversight agencies enough? Can trust be restored? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like this video if you believe accountability has to start from within. And subscribe if you want more coverage on the stories that expose what's really happening behind the headlines. Because the truth, it doesn't need a badge. It just needs light. There's something deeply chilling about knowing the people meant to uphold the law were actively breaking it, and not in the shadows, not by bending the rules, but by building an entire trafficking ecosystem protected by the very authority they swore to serve. This wasn't some backdoor deal in a dark alley. These were uniformed officers, some still on duty, using flashing lights to escort cartel shipments across state lines, pulling over competitors, clearing checkpoints, leveraging their badges as passes into a criminal underworld where they weren't just complicit, they were essential. That's the real weight of Operation Shattered Shield. It wasn't about a few officers making bad choices. It exposed how the cartels didn't just infiltrate, they embedded. They identified vulnerabilities, exploited institutional weaknesses, and positioned corrupt officers where they could offer maximum operational cover. And it worked for years. Think about what that means. The entire concept of public safety gone. The legal system undermined from within. How do you tell a community to trust the process when it was the process that protected traffickers? How do you ask people to cooperate with law enforcement when their local officers were running cartel routes like it was part of the job? The betrayal runs that deep. Federal investigators knew it. That's why this wasn't a reactive arrest. This was a coordinated dismantling. It involved months of digital surveillance, financial forensics, undercover operations, and strategic planning. Because if they'd moved too early, the network would have buried itself again. What the FBI found wasn't just shocking, it was deeply structured. Shell companies were set up with layers of obfuscation. Ghost contracts tied to fake vendors. Money that passed through 3 or 4 intermediaries before being laundered into legitimacy. It wasn't sloppy. It was professional. And that's what made it dangerous. This wasn't a gang bribing a cop for a one-off favor. It was a multi-million-dollar logistics network that required coordination, discipline, and silence. The officers involved weren't acting alone. They worked together, some knowingly, others kept compartmentalized to avoid detection. There were checkpoints timed to avoid other patrols, routes mapped through jurisdictions with less oversight. fake IDs, encrypted devices, burner phones. And all of it backed by real authority badges, patrol cars, internal databases. Everything designed to serve justice, redirected to serve cartels. This is what happens when systemic oversight fails. Somewhere along the way, internal checks didn't check. Warning signs didn't trigger audits. Whistleblowers were ignored or worse, silenced. And in that silence, the corruption grew. Quietly. Effectively. Until it became something too big to hide. The impact wasn't just procedural, it was emotional. When the arrests went public, communities were blindsided. These weren't faceless officers from distant cities. These were local figures, coaches, church volunteers, family friends. And now they were being exposed as key players in one of the most organized trafficking efforts ever tied to U.S. law enforcement. You could feel the fracture. People didn't know who to trust. They questioned every traffic stop, every siren, every interaction with someone in uniform. Because how do you separate the good from the bad when they all wear the same badge? And that's exactly what makes rebuilding trust so difficult. Reforms were announced quickly. Oversight agencies were introduced. Internal audits ramped up. Background checks reviewed. But the truth is those fixes, while important, don't erase the damage. They don't undo the fact that institutional corruption isn't just a crime, it's a betrayal. One that people feel personally. The cleanup can't be cosmetic. It can't be about press releases or performative accountability. It has to be structural, permanent, relentless. Every department touched by this scandal had to reckon with hard questions. How was this allowed to happen? Who else looked the other way? Were supervisors complicit, or just careless? Was this isolated, or is it a template for something bigger, something national? That's what makes Operation Shattered Shield such a pivotal case. It forced law enforcement across the country to ask those questions, to stop assuming the threat was out there, and start checking their own ranks. Because cartels evolve fast. They learn what works. And if infiltrating police departments works once, you can bet they'll try it again somewhere else, under a different name, with new faces. And the truth is, the warning signs were there. They always are. Financial red flags, unexplained wealth, officers living above their means, unusual transfers, suppressed complaints, inconsistent reporting. But when there's no real will to investigate, those signs get dismissed as anomalies. And that's exactly the gap these networks exploit. There's a reason this case is now being studied in federal training programs. Because it wasn't just about catching bad actors. It was about exposing how the system gave them cover in the first place. It highlighted the urgent need for financial scrutiny, not just of criminals, but of officers themselves. It emphasized the role of digital surveillance not just for suspects, but for insiders. It showed how encrypted communication isn't just a tool for the cartel but for the complicit. Every layer of this case peeled back a little more of the institutional rot. And while the arrests were significant, they weren't the end. They were the beginning of what should be an ongoing reformation of internal police culture. A system that can't check itself will be corrupted. And if law enforcement is truly committed to restoring public trust, it has to go beyond punishment. It has to be transparent, consistent, willing to clean house not when it's convenient, but when it's necessary. Because if not, this will happen again, in another city, with new names. And maybe next time, it won't be 20 officers, it'll be 50, or 100. And by then, how much damage will be done? That's the urgency behind this case. It's not just about what was uncovered. It's about what's still hiding, what hasn't been caught yet, and whether the system is brave enough to find it before it grows again. This wasn't a one-time scandal. It was a flashing red alert. And if the message wasn't clear before, it should be now. You can't fight organized crime with disorganized ethics. You can't protect communities when your own people are on the take. And you can't rebuild trust unless you're willing to face the truth of who broke it. The question that keeps echoing after Operation Shattered Shield isn't just how did this happen, it's how long was this happening before anyone noticed. And maybe more importantly, how many other departments across the country are sitting on the same ticking time bomb. Because when you pull back from the arrests and look at the infrastructure behind it all, what you see isn't just a few corrupt cops. You see a system that didn't ask enough questions. A system that had no mechanisms in place to detect fraud that was this elaborate, this entrenched, and this brazen. Let's not forget this was a $3.4 million operation built on forged documents, ghost contracts, and fake companies, all slipping through under the radar of institutions supposedly built for accountability. And yet, for 3 years, these officers operated under the protection of their own uniforms. They didn't just shield cartel operations, they became the shield. They weaponized public trust, department resources, and their insider access to help criminal networks avoid detection. And the community they were supposed to protect, left completely exposed. That's the part that stings the most. Because this betrayal wasn't just about money or drugs. It was about power being used in exactly the wrong way. These weren't just officers cashing in under the table. They were actively contributing to a national crisis, making it easier for cartels to move drugs, launder money, and expand their reach. Every illegal shipment they escorted put lives at risk. Every dollar they cleaned helped fuel more violence, more addiction, more harm. And it was all hidden behind flashing lights and badges. When the arrests happened, the optics were brutal. Officers being led out of their own precincts in handcuffs. Raids at homes of trusted officials. Communities forced to reckon with the fact that the people they relied on weren't protecting them, they were exploiting them. And for many people, it's not the drugs or the money that hurts the most. It's the lie. It's the fact that the uniform no longer meant what it used to. That the oath meant nothing to those who broke it. Restoring that trust is going to take more than a few good speeches and internal memos. It's going to take transparency. Constant and comfortable transparency. It's going to take audits, civilian oversight, and zero tolerance for silence. Because silence is what let this network grow. Silence is what let the cartels in. One of the hardest truths exposed by this operation is that organized crime doesn't need to kick down the door, they wait for the system to open it. All they need is access. A weak policy here. A friend in the department there. A compromised officer willing to take a cut. That's how they get in. And once they do, it's like a virus, quiet, fast spreading, and hard to remove. What Operation Shattered Shield proved is that dismantling something like this isn't about luck. It's about effort. It took 3 years of surveillance, informants, financial tracking, and interagency coordination just to begin to entangle this network. It required strategic raids, forensic accounting, and dozens of simultaneous operations. Because once the net was cast, there could be no slip-ups, no second chances. Any delay, and the network would vanish back into the shadows. That's why the arrests felt so sudden. But they weren't. They were the result of years of behind-the-scenes work by agents who knew they were up against an enemy that didn't wear a uniform, or worse, one that did. And that's the scariest part. Because it means this isn't over. Not even close. There are more cracks in the system. More vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. And unless law enforcement across the country learns from this, really learns from it, it's only a matter of time before the next Shattered Shield unfolds somewhere else. So what can be done? It starts with vigilance, internal and external. It means monitoring not just the streets, but the stations, following the money, investigating anomalies, and listening when people raise red flags, even if they're uncomfortable, even if they involve people in power. Because the truth is simple, you can't stop corruption if you're afraid to confront it. If you're watching this and you're angry, good. You should be. This is the kind of betrayal that deserves outrage. But let that outrage push for real change. Drop a comment if your trust has been shaken. If you've seen similar signs in your own community. Share your thoughts, your stories, your concerns. Like the video if you believe justice starts on the inside. And subscribe, because this isn't the last time we'll see power used the wrong way, but it might be the last time it goes unchallenged, if we keep holding the line.